All right, muchachos and muchachas, it's the Hoplite channel, back again for the third installment of the fantastic and infamous work by Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince, Part 3. Yep, this is the conclusion for my three-part series on The Prince. I appreciate everybody coming back for the conclusion here if you went to parts 1 and 2. If you haven't yet, I recommend you go back and watch those two installments before this one. But if this is the only one you want to see, or if you're just here to see what the channel is all about, welcome nonetheless. So we left off part 2 of The Prince, and I talked about the historical context of The Prince, the time in which it was written, the warring houses, warring between the Borgias and the Medicis, and how Machiavelli's understanding of politics, of power, of deception as a means to power was forged in that time. But for part 3, I want to talk more about the legacy of the Prince and what it meant after the author's passing and its adoption on a much larger scale. So going back before The Prince was published, we see that it was in a manuscript entitled De Principatibus, which is Latin for of principalities. And this was written in about 1513. They figured out that Machiavelli had first written down the original manuscript in that year. But we saw from part 1 that Machiavelli died in 1527. So how do we get The Prince? Well, they went back into his writings, and in De Principatibus, they found The Prince, and they published it for Machiavelli posthumously in 1532 as its own work. But before they could, The Prince, because it was such a controversial book, the contents were considered, in some circles, perhaps evil, or at least underhanded and dishonorable. So in the very Catholic country of Italy, for this work to be published, it would have to go through an approval process. And we see that the authorization for The Prince to be published was given none other than by Pope Clement VII, who in a former life was Julio de' Medici. So Pope Clement VII was in fact a Medici. He was from the Medici house. And I think when he figured out, oh, it's for, my relative Lorenzo, okay, yeah, I will bless The Prince, even though by Catholic standards it's a pretty nasty book. So Pope Clement VII authorizes the Prince to be printed, and in 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli died, it saw print. So what's the overall legacy of The Prince? Well, if you're a fan of history or literature in general, you know the term Machiavellian is due in large part, if not entirely, to The Prince. So the legacy of The Prince is the legacy of Niccolò Machiavelli. Even though he wrote other works, The Prince is his most famous work, and it's where we get this term. And instead of giving it a definition, I kind of condensed it down to 3 different understandings, in that power is superior to morality, fear beats love, and effectual truth versus virtue is the cornerstone of what Machiavelli regarded the Prince as in an individual prince. His primary occupation is determining virtue versus effectual truth. And this sounds like a rationalization of virtue, and it kind of is, but this is just, his practical way of understanding virtue was, does the virtue at hand serve the prince's quest for power? Yes, then it is an effectual truth. It is virtuous for the prince, and it exists as a virtue, therefore it's good to go. So when will it behoove a prince to be generous? Okay, in this circumstance, that's an effectual truth. Will it behoove the prince to be generous in this circumstance? No. Well, then it's an ineffectual truth, therefore it's a useless virtue. It rationalizes virtues because, as I said in my Stoicism series, virtues are what guides a Stoic to happiness, and they're immutable, right? Virtues are always good for their own sake, because they seek to raise the human spirit, raise the human condition above simple barbaric living like a beast would live. But Niccolò Machiavelli says, well, man and beast are two separate things, but man can pursue beast-like interests without concerning himself with virtue or love or morality, and that can still be useful for him. As a Stoic, we would say, if you can't pursue what you're looking to achieve through the virtues, it cannot lead you to happiness, because all happiness is found through utilizing the virtues. Machiavelli would say, yeah, that's crap. If it's effectual truth, it's a useful virtue. If it's just a virtue for virtue's sake, and it doesn't get you power, it doesn't raise your status, it doesn't achieve an end, it's useless. It's Machiavellian, right? Deceit can be used for good, if the good is the power of the prince being enhanced. Okay, so who are some notable readers of The Prince? Well, we see many founding fathers of the American Revolution were. Ben Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton all read The Prince, all spoke about the truths in The Prince. So you could say that all of these men being at the foundation of America, having read The Prince, maybe it came in handy. Maybe their understanding of The Prince is what made the American Revolution, in part, successful. But we see some other individuals read The Prince. Napoleon Bonaparte. That should come as no surprise, right? I covered Napoleon in von Clausewitz's On War. And according to sources, when Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo and had to retreat, they found his copy of The Prince in his carriage. So he kept it close at hand. Other notable readers, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini. We know these gentlemen, right, from World War II. Not the most savory of characters, so that one should come as no surprise. And last, John Gotti, famous American gangster of the modern era, post-World War II. He considered The Prince the gangster's Bible. So if you were in his family, if you were in his mafia, you probably had to read The Prince. That was probably assigned homework if you were in John Gotti's crew. Anyway, speaking of homework, let's do some right now. I got the Prince copy right here. We're going to jump into our last bit of readings for part 3, and I will provide the go-bys as always. Okay, let's jump to, this is page 89, chapter 17. And this is titled, Of Cruelty and Clemency, and Whether It Is Better to Be Loved or Feared. Proceeding on the other qualities before named, I say that every prince must desire to be considered merciful and not cruel. He must, however, take care not to misuse this mercifulness. Cesare Borgia was considered cruel, but his cruelty had brought order to the Romagna, united it and reduced it to peace and fealty. A prince, therefore, must not mind incurring the charge of cruelty for the purpose of keeping his subjects united and faithful. For with a very few examples, he will be more merciful than those who from excess of tenderness allow disorders to arise, from whence spring bloodshed and rapine. For these, as a rule, injure the whole community, while the executions carried out by the prince injure only individuals. And of all princes, it is impossible for a new prince to escape the reputation of cruelty, new states being always full of dangers. Wherefore Virgil, through the mouth of Dido, says, Res dura et regni novitas me talia cogunt, moliri et late finis custode tueri. From this arises the question whether it is better to be loved more than feared, or feared more than loved. The reply is that one ought to be feared than loved, if one of the two has to be wanting. For it may be said of men in general that they are ungrateful, voluble, dissemblers, anxious to avoid danger, and covetous of gain. As long as you benefit them, they are entirely yours. They offer you their blood, their goods, their life, and their children, as I have before said, when the necessity is remote. But when it approaches, they revolt. And the prince who has relied solely on their words without making other preparations is ruined. For the friendship which is gained by purchase, and not through grandeur and nobility of spirit, is bought, but not secured. and at a pinch is not to be expended in your service. And men have less scruple in offending one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. For love is held by a chain of obligation, which, men being selfish, is broken whenever it serves their purpose. But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment, which never fails. But when the prince is with his army and has a large number of soldiers under his control, then it is extremely necessary he should not mind being thought cruel. For without this reputation, he cannot keep an army united or disposed to any duty. Among the noteworthy actions of Hannibal is numbered this, that although he had an enormous army composed of men of all nations and fighting in foreign countries, there never arose any dissension either among them or against the prince, either in good fortune or in bad. This could not be due to anything but his inhuman cruelty, which together with his infinite other virtues made him always venerated and terrible in the light of his soldiers. And without it, his other virtues would not have sufficed to produce that effect. I conclude, therefore, with regard to being feared and loved, that men love at their own free will, but fear at the will of the prince, and that a wise prince must rely on what is in his power and not on what is in the power of others, and he must only contrive to avoid incurring hatred, as has been explained. Alrighty, so we finally get to it, right? You sat through literally 2.5 episodes of the Hoplite channel to get to the famous quote, "'Tis better to be feared than loved if you have to choose between the two." Right. What he's saying, of course, is that, listen, you're a prince, right? You have power, you have control, you want to keep that. Everybody wants to be loved, right? Everybody wants to be the nice guy that other people love to be around. But the fact of the matter is, when these people are put to the test and they have to make a decision on something, they will more often than not betray the one they love. They will not, however, betray the one they fear. Because if you think about it, if they betray the one they love, all they're losing is the love that they perhaps had mutually. But if they offend the one they fear, that could have consequences, as in that guy might come and kick my ass. He might take my stuff. He might take my wife. He might take my kids. He'll probably just take my wife and I'll have to keep the kids. But he'll take stuff. He'll hurt things. He'll break stuff. I don't want to offend the guy I fear, because that means further consequence, future pain could be coming my way. If I have to offend someone I love, well, I'll just make it up to him later, and maybe we'll have that bond again. Machiavelli says that's why it's better to be feared than loved. Love is something that obligates people only up until a point, but fear is something that perhaps obligates people beyond what they can foresee. And the fear of that unknown is what keeps them loyal to you. And as he says here with the soldiers, and he actually uses Hannibal as an example, is that Hannibal wasn't able to convince everyone to follow him to Rome, to ride elephants over the Alps because he was a nice guy. It's like, yeah, people might have liked him, but like, hey, Hannibal, it's like, we're from Northern Africa. You want us to go all the way around through Northern Europe and then what, traverse the Alps so we can invade Rome? That's going to be a crazy undertaking, but I'm going to do it because I fear you and you have the ability to be inhumanely cruel. And Machiavelli is saying that's probably why Hannibal got what he got, because he had all the other virtues at his beck and call. He was a well-regarded, well-respected man, a leader, but it was most likely the fact that he was willing to do unspeakable harm to the people in his command if they didn't follow him. And that was the deciding factor in Machiavelli's estimation, was that Hannibal, that although he had an enormous army composed of men of all nations and fighting in foreign countries, there never arose any dissension either among them or against the prince, in good fortune or bad. This is not due to anything but his inhumane cruelty, which together with his infinite other virtues made him always venerated and terrible in the sight of his soldiers. You want your soldiers to respect you. You want them to look up to you. But more importantly, when push comes to shove, and even when it looks like you're losing, you want them to be more afraid of what you'll do to them if they abandon you than what the enemy could do to them. And that's what, in his estimation, Machiavelli says that's what made Hannibal such an effective ruler. Debatable. Okay, let us jump to the next reading. This will be on page 92, chapter 18, under the title, In What Way Princes Must Keep Faith. And Machiavelli wrote, "How laudable it is for a prince to keep good faith and live with integrity, and not with astuteness. Every one knows. Still the experience of our times shows those princes to have done great things who have had little regard for good faith, and have been able to, by astuteness, to confuse men's brains, and who have ultimately overcome those who have made loyalty their foundation. You must know then that there are two methods of fighting, the one by the law and the other by force. The first method is that of men, the second of beasts. But as the first method is often insufficient, one must have recourse to the second. It is therefore necessary for a prince to know well how to use both the beast and the man. This was covertly taught to rulers by ancient writers, who relate how Achilles and many others of those ancient princes were given to Chiron, the centaur, to be brought up and educated under his discipline. The parable of this semi-animal, semi-human teacher is meant to indicate that a prince must know how to use both natures, and that the one without the other is not durable. A prince being thus obliged to know well how to act as a beast must imitate the fox and the lion, for the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. Those that wish to be only lions do not understand this. If all men were good, this precept would not be a good one. But as they are bad and would not observe their faith with you, so you are not bound to keep faith with them. Nor have legitimate grounds ever failed a prince who wished to show colorable excuse for the non-fulfillment of his promise. Of this one could furnish an infinite number of modern examples, and show how many times peace has been broken, and how many promises rendered worthless. But the faithlessness of princes, and those that have been best able to imitate the fox, have succeeded best. But it is necessary to be able to disguise this character well, and to be a great feigner and dissembler. And men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities, that one who deceives will always find those who will allow themselves to be deceived." Whoa. Underhandedness. Okay, yeah. So, as I was saying in the opening, the legacy. This chapter, it's only, it's 3 pages. But it is the root of Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism is this chapter. You want to be the beast and the man, okay? You want to abide by the law when it serves your purposes, but discard the law when it no longer serves those purposes. And you have to be willing to use deceit to do this, and come up with whatever excuse you can come up with later on to tell people, hey, I did what I did, but this is why I did it. You understand, right? Of course you understand. It was necessity. It was what we needed to do at the time. It was vital. And the people will look at you and say, well, yeah, I guess at the time it seemed like something had to be done, and I guess if you had to do it, then yeah, I'm willing to believe you. I'm willing to be deceived. Of course you are. Of course you are. That's why I'm the prince and you're not. That's what happens, right? You want to be the lion and the fox. The two beasts that he says that the man must be able to understand the nature of is the fox and the lion. The lion is strong. It's a big cat. It can mess stuff up. It can fight off the wolves. The fox can't. But the lion is big and strong, but it's not crafty enough to avoid the hunter's traps. The fox is, right? That's where you get crazy like a fox, smart as a fox. Lions are brave. Lions are big. Lions are bold. No one will attack the lion directly because they risk destruction. But they'll try to deceive the lion. So you must be as crafty as the fox. And it looks like he picks the fox as the better of the two. So a prince, in order to do what he needs to do to consolidate and improve his position and raise his level of power, he needs to think more like the fox, but keep the lion on a short leash. Because if he unleashes the lion, then it's open war. And then he essentially can't bring it, he can't recall it back. So the fox is what he needs to be in times of peace, in times where he has the ability to think things through rationally, but he always must remind his enemies that he has the lion close at hand. But he must think like a fox more often than not. And yeah, that's how a prince gets ahead. He must never fail to miss an opportunity to deceive if it serves his purposes, because there's always necessity that will excuse his deceit, and there are always people out there who will allow themselves to be deceived, right? I wonder what that sounds like in 2021, if that's going on right now. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Just thinking out loud here. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter, 19, page 95. And this is under the title, That We Must Avoid Being Despised and Hated. And Machiavelli wrote, the prince must, as already stated, avoid those things which will make him hated or despised. And whenever he succeeds in this, he will have done his part, and will find no danger in other vices. He will chiefly become hated, as I said, by being rapacious, and usurping the property and women of his subjects, which he must abstain from doing, and whenever one does not attack the property or honor of the generality of men, they will live contented, and one will only have to combat the ambition of a few, who can be easily held in check in many ways. He is rendered despicable by being thought changeable, frivolous, effeminate, timid, and irresolute, which a prince must guard against as a rock of danger, and so contrive that his actions show grandeur, spirit, gravity, and fortitude. And as to the government of his subjects, let his sentence be irrevocable, and let him adhere to his decisions, so that no one may think of deceiving or cozening him. The prince who creates such an opinion of himself gets a great reputation, and it is very difficult to conspire against one who has a great reputation, and he will not easily be attacked, so long as it is known that he is capable and revered by his subjects. For a prince must have two kinds of fear, one internal as regards his subjects, one external as regards foreign powers. But with regard to the subjects, if not acted on from the outside, it is still to be feared lest they conspire in secret, from which the prince may guard himself well by avoiding hatred and contempt, and keeping the people satisfied with him, which it is necessary to accomplish, as has been related at length. And one of the most potent remedies that a prince has against conspiracies is that of not being hated by the mass of the people. For whoever conspires always believes that he will satisfy the people by the death of their prince. But if he thought to offend them by doing this, he would fear to engage in such an undertaking, for the difficulties that conspirators have to meet are infinite. Okay, so what is he saying here? This is the tightrope the prince has to walk, right? If you seek to be feared rather than loved, you must avoid being hated. And this is the tightrope, right? It is quite easy for someone who is feared to be hated, because fear and hate kind of work on the same wavelength, right? Fear is the foundation of misunderstanding, or of the unknown, the uncertain, the doubt you have, right? I can make that jump. I think I can. Maybe I can't. It's a long way. That's a long way to jump. If I jump and I miss, I fall to my death. I'm afraid of this jump. You don't know if you can make it. You have this doubt, right? If you see a 100-yard gap, you're like, well, I can't make that. That's absurd. You're not afraid of that, right? Because there's nothing in your mind that tells you one way or another. With someone you fear, it's, what is this person going to do? Are they going to treat me well? Are they going to treat me cruelly? Are they going to steal from me? Are they going to give me gifts? Will they treat my family well after I'm dead? Will they enslave them? This fear, this undoubt, that's that jump, that maybe 10, 15-foot jump. You're like, I think I could make that jump, but I don't know. I'm afraid. I'm not going to do it because I don't know. If the jump was 1 foot, you don't fear that jump. If the jump was 100 yards, you wouldn't fear it either, because you wouldn't even try it. You would just know, like, it's one or the other. Fear can lead to hatred, because this uncertainty creates this perception in people's minds that they're in a corner, and they want to get out of this corner, but they're afraid to get out. So they start to hate the thing that's keeping them in this corner. This is the problem with the prince, is that fear, if it's maintained long enough, can lead to hatred, and this is what must be avoided. And what you must always do is seek to be feared among your population, but respected as well. And you do this by avoiding the vice of being rapacious, which means that if you're in charge, you can the quickest way to being hated is just to despoil everybody who's your subject, right? Is to abuse the men who are your subjects physically or financially, to take their wives as mistresses, to abuse their kids and make them, work as serfs. If you abuse the generality of people, this fear will later give way to hatred. And if you are hated by your general population of subjects, this is where conspiracy takes root. Because there are people who want to be in your position, and if they get the sense among the people that you are feared, but you are also hated, they will seek to turn the majority of that motion towards hatred. And then when the people hate you more than fear you, this is when you are overthrown. But he says, if you maintain good relations with your subjects, and you avoid being hated or held in contempt, the people will still support you. Even though they have that twinge of fear, they will still support you, and they will still maintain the order that you're trying to keep in your princedom, your kingdom. Therefore, people who conspire against you will think twice, because if they assume they can change the opinion of the people because they have a tepid kind of, let's say, an inkling that you are weak, but later find out that the majority of the people support you, well, then it's going to be their head that goes in the noose. So they have the low ground. The prince has the high ground if he maintains the respect of his people. Not necessarily love, but just the respect and not hatred. Conspirators will always think twice if they have the sense among the people that overall you are not hated, you are respected. But the fear that you create in the population must never rise to a point where they hold you in contempt and they look at you as a tyrant, because then you will be overthrown, and that's kind of only a matter of time. If you look at the great emperors of Rome, like Julius Caesar, like Caesar Augustus, like Caesar was assassinated by the nobility. Caesar Augustus was probably the most respected emperor in Roman history. And it was because the people respected his ability as a leader. They feared him as well because he had that, he was the emperor. He could bring down the might of the legion on the people. But they respected him, and he made life for them overall easier to bear. So the conspiracies against Caesar Augustus were put down with Mark Antony and the rest, and Cleopatra, because the people as a whole still supported Caesar, whether Augustus or Julius. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter. Same chapter, page 97. This is a longer read. So we'll go to it right now. Machiavelli continues. I conclude, therefore, that a prince need trouble little about conspiracies when the people are well disposed. But when they are hostile and hold him in hatred, then he must fear everything and everybody. Well-ordered states and wise princes have studied diligently not to drive the nobles to desperation, and to satisfy the populace and keep it contented, for this is one of the most important matters that a prince has to deal with. It may perhaps seem to some that, considering the life and death of many Roman emperors, that there are instances contrary to my opinion, finding that some who always lived nobly and showed great strength of character nevertheless lost the empire or were killed by their subjects who conspired against them. Wishing to answer these objections, I will discuss the qualities of some emperors, showing the cause of their ruin not to be at variance with what I have stated. And I will also meanwhile consider the things to be noted by whoever reads the deeds of these times. I will content myself with taking all of those emperors who succeeded to the empire, from Marcus the philosopher to Maximinus. These were Marcus, Commodus his son, Pertinax, Julianus, Severus, Antoninus, Caracalla his son, Macrinus, Helioglobus, Alexander, and Maximinus. And the first thing to note is that whereas other princes have only to contend against the ambition of the great and the insolence of the people, the Roman emperors had a third difficulty, that of having to support the cruelty and avarice of the soldiers, which was such that it was the cause of the ruin of many, it being hardly possible to satisfy both the soldiers and the people. For the people love tranquility and therefore like pacific princes, but the soldiers prefer a prince of military spirit, who is insolent, cruel, and rapacious. They wish him to exercise these qualities on the people, so that they may get double pay and give vent to their avarice and cruelty. Thus it came about that those emperors, who by nature or art had not such a reputation as could keep both parties in check, were invariably ruined, and the greater number of them who were raised to the empire, being new men, knowing the difficulties of these two opposite dispositions, confined themselves to satisfy the soldiers and thought little of injuring the people. From these causes it resulted that Marcus, Pertinax, and Alexander, being all of modest life, lovers of justice, enemies of cruelty, humane and benign, all came to a sad end except Marcus. Marcus alone lived and died in honor, because he succeeded to the empire by hereditary right, and did not owe it either to the soldiers or the people. Besides which, possessing many virtues which made him revered, he kept both parties in their place as long as he lived, and was never either hated or despised. But Pertinax was cruel, and was created emperor against the will of the soldiers, who, being accustomed to live licentiously under Commodus, could not put up with the honest life to which Pertinax wished to limit them. So that having made himself hated, and to this contempt being added because he was old, he was ruined at the very beginning of his administration. Whence it may be seen that hatred is gained as much by good works as by evil, and therefore, as I said before, a prince who wishes to maintain the state is often forced to do evil. For when that party, whether populace, soldiery, or nobles, whichever it be that you consider necessary to you for keeping your position, is corrupt, you must follow its humor and satisfy it, and in that case good works will be inimical to you. Considering, on the other hand, the qualities of Commodus, Severus, Antoninus, Caracalla, and Maximinus, you will find them extremely cruel and rapacious. To satisfy the soldiers, there was no injury which they would not inflict on the people, and all except Severus ended badly. Severus, however, had such abilities that by maintaining the soldiers friendly to him, he was able to reign happily, although he oppressed the people, for his virtues made him so admirable in the sight both of the soldiers and the people, that the latter were, in some degree, astonished and stupefied, while the former were respectful and contented. Okay, sorry, that was longer, but I thought it was a good illustration of his point here, in that he uses the examples of the Roman emperors and why even the good emperors fell into ruin, whereas the emperors who were cruel, almost all of them fell into ruin, because they had to satisfy the nobility, the populace, but the soldiers as well. And this is the problem with running an empire, is that the empire has to be maintained through military force. There is no other way to do it. You could do it through economics, but that will only take you so far. To have an empire worth its salt, it has to have a formidable military force. And the emperors, to maintain control, had to make sure the nobility didn't conspire against them, had to make sure the population feared and respected him, but they also had to satisfy the third, which was the appetites of the soldiers. And the soldiers understood that they were the backbone of the empire, so they could make demands of their own, of the emperor. And the emperors who gave in to too many demands of the soldiers allowed the soldiers license to abuse the population. And by doing so, he became hated. The soldiers can maintain order for the emperor, but again, the soldiers are vastly outnumbered by the populace, which are vastly outnumbered by the nobility. I'm sorry, the nobility is outnumbered by the soldiers are outnumbered by the population. So if you serve one of those three to the detriment of the other two, the Roman emperors risked being overthrown by those other two factions. Marcus, he said, didn't owe his ascension to the throne to the nobility or the population because he was gifted it on a hereditary basis. If you look at Marcus Aurelius's rise to the throne of the emperor, though, it was a roundabout way. I wouldn't say it was a direct hereditary inheritance, because if you look at it, I think it was, I did a segment on Stoicism with the Stoic Titans, Marcus Aurelius. He inherited it because his uncle died, and as far as the bloodline went, he was next, but it wasn't a direct lineage. But his son Commodus also inherited the throne via the bloodline. And Commodus was one of the worst emperors in the entire history of Rome. He used to, dress up like a gladiator and get into mock fights with gladiators. The population hated him because all he would do is raise taxes, spend all of their money on lavish games for his entertainment. His wealth was transferred directly into his bank accounts, and the soldiers didn't respect him either because they knew he was a pretender. So he was assassinated. So you have two rulers, Marcus the father, Commodus the son, two very different men, but it was Marcus who ruled with most likely respect and love. He was not hated or feared by the population. He was respected and loved. But Marcus made sure that he kept all three in check, and he says a prince must do so as well. The soldiers are one thing, and they'll pretty much do what they're told based upon pay, but you can't give in to their appetites, which is to abuse their position, to abuse the population. You have to use the soldiers also as a threat against the nobility, as in anyone who conspires against me, I'll bring the military against them, and let the population know that you will look after them like a shepherd looks after their flock, but you also have the military if they decide to revolt. So you have three different things to manage, and he uses the example of the emperors to show that it was even more difficult in those days. Whereas in modern day Italy for his time, it was most likely the nobility and the population that you just had to concern yourself with. But he says that by being hated, you open the door for any three of those different interests, be it the population, the nobility, or the soldiers, to conspire against you, either because they think you're being weak or they think you're hated to the point where you can be assassinated, as Commodus was. Okay, let us move to the next reading. And this will be the final reading of this segment. This part 3 of The Prince. This is under chapter 25, how much fortune can do in human affairs and how it may be opposed. Page 120. And Machiavelli wrote, nevertheless, that our free will may not be altogether extinguished, I think it may be true that fortune is the ruler of half our actions, but that she allows the other half or thereabouts to be governed by us. I would compare her to an impetuous river that, when turbulent, inundates the plains, casts down trees and buildings, removes earth from this side and places it on the other. Everyone flees before it, and everything yields to its fury without being able to oppose it. And yet, though it is of such a kind, still when it is quiet, men can make provisions against it by dikes and banks, so that when it rises, it will either go into a canal, or its rush will not be so wild and dangerous. So it is with fortune, which shows her power where no measures have been taken to resist her, and directs her fury where she knows that no dikes or barriers have been made to hold her. No man is found so prudent as to be able to adapt himself to this, either because he cannot deviate from that to which his nature disposes him, or else because, having always prospered by walking in one path, he cannot persuade himself that it is well to leave it, and therefore the cautious man, when it is time to act suddenly, does not know how to do so, and is consequently ruined. For if one could change one's nature with time and circumstances, fortune would never change. I conclude then that fortune varying and men remaining fixed in their ways, they are successful so long as these ways conform to circumstances. But when they are opposed, then they are unsuccessful. I certainly think that it is better to be impetuous than cautious. For fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force. And it can be seen that she lets herself be overcome by the bold rather than by those who proceed coldly. And therefore, like a woman, she is always a friend of the young, because they are less cautious, fiercer, and master her with great audacity. True. Okay. Interesting. Fortune is like a woman. So in this final reading here, what he is saying is fortune favors the bold, right? As the Romans would say, fortuna audaces iovat. Fortune favors the bold. You must treat fortune as the second half of all things in human affairs. The first half is your planning, your preparation, your talent, your skill, the conditions in which you live, the monetary resources at your disposal, And the second half is just good old-fashioned luck. Will you have good luck or will you have bad luck? Bad luck is that river that comes rushing at you like in a flood and will overtake you and will wash your town away if you have not prepared in the future, or in the past, by making dikes and banks, as he says. Because when times are easy and when good luck is shining on you, you need to be building these dikes and these banks. So if good luck turns to bad, you can weather that storm. But he says when good luck becomes bad luck responds more to the impetuous man, right? It's like the sassy woman who's just got a bad attitude and she's on a warpath. The guy who stands up and sticks his chest out and tells her how it's going to be, she will earn his respect much more quickly than a man who is deferential or who says, well, happy wife, happy life. Yeah, that guy gets swept away by the torrent, by the river. The one who stands up, the one who takes life by the horns, is the one who can turn bad luck back into good. So he says it's better for the bold prince to be the one in charge when bad luck comes, because that is how bad luck can be redirected into good luck. Fortune favors the bold. So says Machiavelli. All right, that'll do it for part 3 and the final part to the Prince. I don't know, this one probably went on longer than it should have, but I appreciate everybody who stayed for the duration again. So the Prince and von Clausewitz is On War, and Sun Tzu's Art of War. If you read those 3 together and you take them in any succession, I think those are 3 fantastic books to get a very good understanding of the school of thought that might makes right. Deception on the battlefield can be a virtue. Sometimes it's better to be feared rather than loved. In Machiavelli's opinion, it's always better to be feared rather than loved if you have one of the 2 to choose from. And that there are effectual truths and then there are virtues. And if you're going to be a prince, a general, a leader of men, you want to succeed, virtue, we want to say that virtue is the road to happiness. All men should pursue virtue, but effectual truth, which is what virtue is necessary here and what virtue can I dispose with. Will telling the truth get me anywhere right now? No. Well, then I should lie. Okay. Will being honest right now get me somewhere? Well, yes. Then I should tell the truth. This is effectual truth. It's rationalization. I get it. But as far as the prince is concerned, you need to rationalize everything you do if you intend to be a prince. And that is all Machiavelli was concerned with. You're a prince, you need to maintain power, and the only way you maintain power is to increase your power. And you need to be thinking about these 3 things as you do so. Because if you're not, you're going to lose. And that's just the way it is. Okay. Once more, Hoplite Channel, The Prince, Part 3, conclusion. Thanks for being here. I'm not sure what topic I'll dive into next, but I'll try to make it a good one. If you like The Prince or any of this discussion, give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, subscribe, and I will try to get more content out here with more frequency. But in any event, appreciate it, and take care.